In the news from Dorchester this week, we have more developments around this year's city election, more decisions about housing plans, and the loss of a local talent who was heading for a shot at the MBA. To fill us in is the managing editor and publisher of the Dorchester Reporter, Bill Forry. Thank you very much for being with us, Bill.
Hi, Chris. Good to be with you.
So I want to start with the city election because one of the things that I certainly got it first from the Dorchester Reporter was that the state senator for Dorchester and South Boston, Nick Collins, was not going to run for mayor. Not exactly shocking, but when you look at how this changes the usual chemistry of open elections to mayor, what does that mean?
Right. Yeah. So Senator Nick Collins, who has been mulling a run for mayor, even though it is, technically, signatures are still being circulated. It's not technically too late to get on the ballot, but it is getting kind of late in the game here for mounting a candidacy. But Senator Collins, obviously a big name in city politics, represents a large chunk of the city, has a pretty good finance war chest already in place. Certainly could have been a contender, would have been a compelling candidate. But he has decided not to run. He put out a statement on Tuesday morning indicating that he's decided he won't run for mayor. So what that, the big headline out of that, I think, is that there won't be, in all likelihood at this point, a contending white candidate, a candidate, a white male candidate for sure, and really no white candidates in this field for mayor, which is notable, right? I mean, this is the first time in the city's history, for sure, since 1821, when the city was incorporated, that there won't be a white man running for mayor or contending for mayor in this cycle. It's all people of color. It's all predominantly women who are running, a 6-person race, and no white candidate. So I did write about that this week in our editorial, and kind of in jest said, well, what's the big deal? This is a strong field of candidates that we have, very, very accomplished people. What do we lose by not having a white candidate, a white man candidate in the field? And really nothing, right? I mean, that's one way of looking at it. The other side of it is, what does it do? What is the dynamic then for the white electorate, which is obviously a sizable chunk of the city? Will white voters who are especially more conservative voters in precincts in Neponset, West Roxbury, Brighton, other parts of the city that tend to, obviously gravitate towards white candidates when they have that choice. What are they going to do in this election? It's an interesting question, right? For those of us who've been following city politics, either as observers or participants for many years, traditionally, it's the Black vote or the Latino vote or the Asian vote that's the swing vote in the final election when it's a head-to-head matchup. And this time around, it's likely to be white voters who will have a swing effect for one candidate or another in the final election. If we think back to 2013, John Conley and Marty Walsh made it into the final election and then really had to compete head-to-head for Black Boston's vote. That was the swing vote in 2013. Marty Walsh prevailed, obviously, on the strength of he was able to align his former rivals, all people of color, behind him. They swung his way, the electorate swung his way, and obviously he was elected. This time around, it'll be interesting to see if we have we will have two candidates of color in the final election, and how will they compete for the white vote? That's going to be a new dynamic in the city election.
Well, it seems here that this isn't something monolithic because you have the kind of white voters in the high voting precinct around Florian Hall and the McKeon Post, but you also have the white people who right now have already gone on the campaign bandwagons for all these other candidates of color.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's nothing monolithic about any voting bloc in the city, Chris, but there will be segments of this electorate that don't have a natural home here. They may not have ever voted for a candidate of color before, and they're going to be presented with that option. And it's going to be interesting how these campaigns strategize around appealing to a segment of the electorate that maybe they haven't factored in before in their citywide candidacies. I think every candidate in the city is trying to win as many votes as they can, but when it comes right down to it, there will be a block of votes more conservative white voters who are going to be looking for a home in November. Maybe they'll some of them will sit it out. I think most won't. Most will participate, and they'll be looking for a candidate who's speaking to their issues.
Speaking beyond race here to geography, really, there are candidates for mayor, contenders who have their bases. I think you and I know where they are, but there are parts of the city beyond those bases. I'm looking at parts of Ward 18 into Hyde Park, Mattapan. What about those people being swing voters too?
Definitely. And this is where people who have an at-large citywide presence already, people like Michelle Wu and Anissa Asabi-George, who have been on the ballot in the entire city, have a little bit of an advantage in speaking to voters who already know who they are. They possibly have already voted for them. Having that citywide presence and familiarity and campaign organization can in a race like this. But for sure, there'll be parts of the city, especially Hyde Park, as you mentioned, places like Reedville, kind of on the outskirts of the city, that are definitely in play. And those voters will be, they don't necessarily have a natural candidate on the ballot for them, and they're going to be an important part of the electorate this time.
I want to turn to another topic here, a very sad story about someone who could have been Dorchester's, next contribution to professional sports. In this case, the NBA. Terrence Clarke, his passing. How has that resounded in the community?
Man, it was a thunderclap last Thursday when news started to move around the city that Terrence Clarke, who's just 19 years old, died in a car crash, a terrible tragedy out in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, he did not survive. Terrence was just an iconic figure, really, especially the teenagers of our city. So many young men and women, kids like my son, who's 17, idolized Terrence Clarke. He was a freshman at the University of Kentucky. But he came up through Dorchester's gyms and community centers, places like the Vine Community Center in Roxbury. He was a student at the Davis Leadership Academy in Fields Corner, was very active in Dorchester Youth Collaborative. So many neighborhood kids, teenagers now, respected him, loved him, were, rooting for him to make it big. He was going to be going into the NBA draft. That's why he was in Los Angeles last week for training camp. And man, it's a big tragedy. A lot of spontaneous observances, street side vigils, and just a lot of anguish for our young people and for his family, of course. Condolences to the Clarke family and to all of his friends and classmates here in the city of Boston.
Another topic reporter covered recently was something that people have lived with so long that they almost stopped paying attention to it. And that's all of the trash alongside the expressway that goes through Dorchester, which sort of reopens the old wounds about how it got there in the first place. Bill Walczak wrote a great piece about that. So how is that going to be developing in the future now?
Well, we'll see, Chris. I mean, state officials, when Bill took this initiative, by the way, he's one of our columnists, but Bill is a great citizen in the neighborhood, obviously, is always coming up with ideas and floating them through his column. And he wrote about how trash strewn and ugly it's been looking along the MBTA right of way and the expressway, particularly near him in Savin Hill, but also throughout. I've noticed it myself on walks. I think a lot more people are out walking, especially now that the weather's better, and noticing that there is quite a bit of debris and trash. And citizens, people organize cleanups. There was a big cleanup of the Neponset River last weekend that 400 people came out across the city and into Quincy as well and picked up trash. And that's a great, noble effort. Everybody can do their part. Bill's argument is that the state agencies like Mass DOT and the MBTA aren't doing their part sufficiently to clean up the highway and the easements around it, the embankments. And he's not wrong. It looks awful. And a lot of readers responded to his article and said, Bill, you're absolutely right. They suggested alternatives such as maybe planting trees along that route, along the embankment, to maybe make it look better. We'll see what the state does. I think this sort of exposure and pressure from the public is helpful. The squeaky wheel effect, if you will, and Bill's for sure going to be following up on it, and we will too.
Now, the other thing here, this expressway, for people who don't know the feel of things in Dorchester, it sort of blocks out the waterfront, and everybody loves to be near the water when it's not too dangerous. But on the other hand, the expressway is this channel for viewing billboards. It's a great way to get income from those suburban communities. But what does that mean in Dorchester?
Well, billboards have long been a kind of the bane of people's existence who live along or near the expressway. People really, and you're right, it's one of these things you can forget that they're there because you've seen them for so long. But there's a strong civic history of opposing billboards in Dorchester going back to the 1970s and 80s. People like Joe Chason, if you remember him, he's now passed, but
from Savin Hill, yes.
Yeah, he organized civic association groups all up and down the expressway to oppose new billboards and to seek to have some eliminated. And there was success in the 1990s. Then City Councilor Maureen Feeney was a leader on that to get some billboards taken down in exchange for new ones, but a limited amount. Right now, there's a flashpoint of a billboard that's on the Boston Bowl property at Morrissey Boulevard. It's going before the outdoor licensing board next week. Maria Lyons, who is a very outspoken activist from Port Norfolk, wrote a letter to the editor in the Reporter that we published today that really outlines her opposition, the reasons for it. And really her argument is that it's a blight, and it obstructs the view of the water for some people. She's making the case that people in Dorchester should oppose it. There are people who support it as well, but it's an interesting argument, and it speaks to what you mentioned, Chris. We can forget sometimes that Dorchester is a waterfront community because the expressway is such an obstacle, but we very much are. We have a maritime history. We have beaches in Dorchester, obviously, that people like to frequent. And the highway is not going anywhere. Let's be clear about that. But it could be made to look nicer, cleaner, and certainly the argument around billboards is a germane one to that, as people consider what will the future be along this waterfront.
And finally, for people interested in the future, Bill, if they want some more updates, you've got some social media they can check out.
We do. You can access the Reporter many different ways. Of course, we publish the print edition every Wednesday, but you can also go online to .news.com. You can follow us on Twitter @.news, and you can follow us on Instagram as well, and Facebook.
Great. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Chris.
Bill Forry from the Dorchester Reporter. We'll have more news in just a moment.